Well, this is Micah Clark with Indiana Family Forum. I want to welcome you back today. It's been a while since we've done a podcast. I'm excited to have a friend on here that we've had on before, but someone that many of you may know because David Lantz was the leader of the Indiana Christian Coalition in the 1990s here in Indiana. He's an economics professor and an author as well. And we want to interview him today about his new book called The Unraveling. So David, welcome to Indiana Family Forum. Thank you for joining us today.
Well, thank you, Micah, and it's a pleasure to be with you. Merry Christmas to you and your family and your listeners.
We are at year end, and this is very timely because this is something many legislatures have looked at recently, and so we're going to talk about that a little bit. But first of all, tell us what The Unraveling is about this book and what caused you or what led you to write The Unraveling.
Well, one of the things that I do, among other things, I teach economics and political science for Indiana Wesleyan and also for Ivy Tech, as well as statistics for University of Phoenix and one or two other schools. And so the American Enterprise Institute has a program called the Values and Capitalism Project. And in the fall of 2016, they issued a call for papers, so they were looking at stratification of the culture. But one of the books that they had as part of the reading material was a book by Professor Charles Murray called Coming Apart. And one of the things that he talks about that is he talks about how the national character of America is unraveling. And I looked at that, and that launched an essay that I wrote. The American Enterprise Institute didn't use the essay in their seminar, but Craig Ladwig with the Indiana Policy Institute did for his quarterly journal. And so I wrote something that I called The Unraveling, and then over the course of 2017, I fleshed out the book to what I now call The Unraveling of We the People. And so for your radio listeners, talk radio for television, I suppose, if you were to look at it, think of a picture of the Constitution with a torn parchment down the middle between the words We the People, and hence the unraveling of We the People.
You know, David, one of the things I've noticed in our culture is that we have a lot of things today that we didn't used to have. It used to be when we were growing up as kids, we had 2 or 3 TV stations, a couple radio stations. We all had similar curriculum in school, and we were all kind of unified around certain things. Now we're all spread out all over the place. Everybody's on their own devices looking at different things. And we seem to have lost a commonality, and yet many of us assume that civics education was one of those common things that we all understood. And for example, in Indiana, it used to be, and I think it's still this way, all 4th graders studied Indiana history in 4th grade. And so we had this commonality, but what you've uncovered is that we're losing that, and even through civics education, we don't have the commonality we used to think we did.
Well, one of the things, Micah, that I've tried to do is take a little bit of a deep dive. This has been an education journey for myself, and I'm still learning about things. I don't pretend to be an expert in all aspects of it. But in the mid-19th century, from about the 1870s onward, there was a gradual professionalization of the art of teaching. We imported ideas from Prussia, now modern Germany, and became a more drill and kill type of teaching process. The progressive movement, led by people like John Dewey, came out of that and almost went 180 degrees in the opposite direction. I've been reading some things about John Dewey where he literally did not want to teach values to students, and he wanted to get rid of the teaching of history. Well, through much of our history, we use something called the McGuffey Eclectic Reader to not only teach reading and writing and so forth, but also teaching history, using the Bible as backdrop to teach character education. And so gradually we began to move away from this use of character education to what became in the 1960s situational ethics and then value relativism. So I look at books like The Closing of the American Mind by Alan Bloom and tracing some of this loss of our understanding of moral education as we have, quote, evolved our education system, frankly, in the wrong direction.
I saw a headline on Fox News the other day on their website, and the question was, is patriotism divisive? And I thought, man, we've really fallen if people think patriotism is divisive. But that's what civics education was really about. So how did we get on this wrong track to where now we don't even seem to know what civics is anymore?
That's so true. Well, going back again to the progressives in the 1930s, Dewey and a guy named George Counts were on the dissertation committee for a guy by the name of Norman Woelfel. Now, Norman Woelfel went on to write a book called Molders of the American Mind, and in which he looked at the education theories of his day. And I actually have a copy of that book. It was printed in 1934. It actually went through three printings during the depths of the Depression.
So it sold that many copies.
So it sold that many copies, believe it or not, in the depths of the Depression. And so Woelfel captures the idea of the progressives. Counts and Dewey had become enamored with the Soviet style of education, having made trips to Soviet Russia after the Bolshevik Revolution. And so here's what Woelfel said with the blessings of his dissertation committee, of which Dewey and Counts were part of. He said, quote, "The things of highest value for individual experience and for ethical standards in modern America will not, however, be found out so long as intellectual leaders maintain a sensitivity over the supernatural significance of Christian mythology or a sentimental personal attachment to the character of Jesus." In other words, these folks wanted to get rid of anything dealing with Christianity, which had been part of the foundational documents of our country, and just totally do away with it.
Mm-hmm. So we've got this war against Judeo-Christian values that is transpiring in different parts of our schools. I know a name that comes up in your book quite often, and it kind of surprised me because he was somebody who was talked about a lot during the Obama administration, but you jump ahead of the Woelfel book maybe 30, 35 years, and the name Bill Ayers comes up. Explain why that got on your radar again, because it came from, when I read this, Bill Ayers was a terrorist. You'll explain that, I'm sure, and it had some links to President Obama, but he has some education links as well. So tell us why that comes up.
You know, it's an interesting commentary to think about. Bill Ayers, who's part of the Weather Underground, actually had some bombings where at least one police officer was killed, things of that nature. And he comes out of the 1960s, and I focus on Bill Ayers not because he's the only one, but he's a name that people would recognize. Right. Okay. And so people coming out of the sex, drugs, and rock and roll era of the 1960s, he went on to be a professor of political science at the University of Illinois in Chicago. In fact, if you look at his biography, he's now a scholar in residence, in parentheses, retired, there at the University of Illinois. And so one of the things that he got into was creating a whole new sort of civics where he looked at social justice sorts of things and partnered with groups that were funding students who wanted to learn how to create riots and revolution, sort of like what he had done in the 1960s. And in fact, there's an organization called the National Academy of Scholars. I've been in contact with their director of communications, Dr. David Randall, who talks about how that movement created something that he refers to as the new civics. Right. And that type of civics education, liberal, progressive style, has transformed civics education in America. Sort of like, what is it that the cowbird or something like that kicks out the eggs of a rival bird from its nest and then plants its own eggs in that nest, and then the original bird raises the chicks as their own. That's what the progressives have now done in the Educational Society of America.
Okay, now you mentioned something. I want to back up a little bit. You mentioned the term new civics, because when we were first talking about this as you're writing this book and the Dave Randall thing with the council, I think most parents, when you and I talk about civics, and most of our listeners, they're thinking one thing. They're thinking the three branches of government, who was the first president, what is the Declaration of Independence, what's the First Amendment, those types of things. But that's not what civics are anymore. It seems to me civics is much more about community activism.
Well, and that's the way they've translated it. thinking back to the early parts of our country, I mentioned using the McGuffey readers. There's research out of George Mason University where a particular researcher, and I talk about it in my book, has put together a database of Bible verses used in the public newspapers from the 1830s to the 1920s. And so one of the things he realized was that a guy named Samuel Tilden was running for president in 1876. And the Bible verse, 1 Samuel 3:4, starts showing up across newspapers across the country. And it says, the Lord said to Samuel, come here. And so then the next verse is, Samuel said, here I am. And so Samuel Tilden uses that Bible verse sort of like we would use a bumper sticker today. How could he do that? He could do it because Americans in the 1870s and 80s knew their Bible. Because in the newspapers throughout American history, newspapers would print the sermons of pastors, crossword puzzles based on the Bible, etc. And so civics education is not just about knowing how a bill becomes a law, which is what we've reduced it to, but it's also about the creation of an inner moral virtue and the way that we govern our emotional passions so that we can refrain from doing harm to others when we may be debating them in the public square. And so civic education, as traditionally taught in America, used history to teach character education. And we've reduced that in the current way we do our social justice things, where it's much more about advancing a liberal agenda as opposed to learning how to be good citizens of this country.
We're talking today with David Lantz, author of a new book called The Unraveling of We the People. And before I talk, we close and tell people how they can get this book. It's about 100 pages, quick read, very informative. Is there anything else you want to leave our audience with?
Well, I think that there are some things that we can do. Back in the 20s and 30s, the progressives created some documents to radically reform, transform the way we teach what we now call social studies. It wasn't that way prior to that. Well, now I teach, as you mentioned, for various schools. I also teach online. And a lot of school systems today, Micah, are using learning management systems where lesson plans, courses, or just one-off lessons can be shared. Yeah. And I go through in detail in my book about how we, the people, need to use the technology of the day to create lessons. If you have a smartphone that takes pictures and can take audio, then if you remember back in the 1990s, those Harry and Louise commercials about Hillary Care and national health care. Well, today, you don't need a TV studio to create that sort of thing. You can do that in your own kitchen or in your own dining room, and then create lessons to talk about American history. It doesn't have to be done by PhDs who have studied American history for 20 years. You and I can do that. So I talk about how we can do that to begin the process of we the people reforming and transforming and taking our country back.
Great. Well, you do have a lot of points in the book about where we are, where we've been, and what we can do from there. So tell our audience, as we close now, how they can get a copy of the book.
Well, I have a website. It's www.theunraveling.us. You got to put the word "the" and the word "unraveling" together. .us. But I think you're going to be making it available for people that want to donate to AFA of Indiana.
Yeah, we will have some copies available through that people will know through our emails and our newsletters coming up. But if you want to get it right away, theunraveling.us. And David, we're going to have another interview with this and unpack this a little bit more with you later. But I want to thank you for joining us today on Indiana Family Forum. Again, folks, David Lantz, author of the book, The Unraveling. It's at theunraveling.us. So until the next time, David, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Micah.
All right.